My name's Callie, I'm the OKS engineer, and carbon is officially going into the molds. Before we get started, huge announcement for the channel. I am now an official brand ambassador for Fiberglass. Everything composite related on this channel going forward will be done exclusively through them. So happy to have them on board. If you guys like what you see and want to see more, the number one thing that you can do for me is to take a cruise over to their social media pages, all linked in the description. Give them a like or follow and continue this partnership going forward. The first thing I have to do is finish prepping this mold. This is basically right off the plug. It was rough cut, but there's some sharp edges down here, and I think I can trim this thing a little bit closer to the size of the final part. I also need to get rid of all those sharp edges so that when I vacuum bag this whole thing, I have less of a chance of it puncturing the bag. You may also remember that I didn't properly release the third part of this mold, and it permanently adhered itself to the other pieces. So it left excess material that I need to clean up. There were also some voids in the previous layups because I didn't get the fiberglass close enough to the gel coat that I need to come back and fill in with a little extra material. I've pre-drilled holes about every 10 inches or so along the entire parting line of the three pieces of the mold. I'm starting to think that I'm probably going to need more than that, so I'm going to go ahead and come back and double the number of holes. That way I know that that bolted connection is as tight as possible, and hopefully that will prevent, well, I'm going to have a seam line on the inside, but hopefully it'll keep it as small as possible. All right, while the micro balloons and resin cure in the other room, we're going to take that opportunity now to clean this side of the mold up and get it fully ready for the layup. So there's still some clay that was left behind that needs to get cleaned up. There's some shellac left over on specifically this side that we need to clean up. And then I need to get this thing polished up. Now, I'm hoping that the surface is actually good enough from all the efforts I did on the plug that I don't have to actually wet sand anything. I'm going to go straight to just polishing with some compound and a handheld polisher and see if I can't get this thing to be a little bit better. Now, I don't need this to be a perfect polished surface. For a couple of reasons. One, I plan on painting most of the cowling anyways, and so I'm going to scuff up the parts so the paint will adhere to the carbon cowling. So starting with a mirror surface really doesn't make any sense. Outside of that though, I do want to polish it to hopefully help with the release. The smoother this mold is, in theory, the easier the part will come off the mold. I still will also add about 6 or 7 layers of that particle paste to the mold before I do the layup, but we'll get into that in a little bit. I'll start off by cleaning the entire surface with some acetone, and I'll follow that up probably with some pretty significant elbow grease, trying to get the rest of the clay off. To get this thing polished out, I'm going to be using Meguiar's Marine and RV High Gloss Polish. This worked extremely well on the seat mold, so it should also do really well for the cowling mold. It's designed for gel coat on boats and RVs, and that's exactly what we have here. I'm putting that on a foam pad and using a powered polisher, and we'll see if we can get this thing kind of shiny. Oh yeah. Oh, looks great. Heck yeah. So good. Well, this thing actually polished really nicely. It's definitely not perfect, but it's okay-ist. Basically, there are two spots on here where I did a final patch on the plug, and those you can still see. It's not perfect, but once again, I think it's good enough. Especially if I'm going to sand and paint this thing down and put some clear on it, all of that will go away. The other thing to note, just because we're learning here, the shellac that I threw down in this area, there was actually some overspray, and that, it didn't ruin the surface, but it just made it a little bit more dull. One additional downside to using that shellac. Definitely the surface underneath that overspray was cleaner because the rest of this mold actually polished up a lot better. Outside of that, I mean, there were a couple bigger scratches that's now positive material. They've polished down close enough, but I'm not worried about it. This isn't going to be a pure carbon pretty part. It's going to serve its function and it's going to be just fine. The same goes over here for the repair job. I just filled this in once again with some micro balloons. It is, there's actually a little bit more space in here that I could have filled it up to, but I didn't want any excess material preventing that third mold piece from going on, so there will be a small void, but it's much smaller than it was before, and it should make it a little stronger and prevent, God forbid, I get some epoxy resin through into this area. I don't know, hopefully it'll prevent bad things from happening. Same in this corner, but we're good to go on this. I'm going to pull the pink mold off the bench, throw it in here, grab the gray mold, throw it back over there, and then just continue with the process. The only another note that I want to mention is this one had a lot more clay baked into all the edges, so I got to spend a little bit more time getting that clay off. But outside of that, I think this one is going to go just as smoothly as the other one. So I'm pretty stoked with how the molds turned out, polish-wise. The next step would usually be another few layers of Partol paste, my mold release. I don't know why. I'm trying to make sure I don't screw this up, but I started thinking last night, and I was wondering if this polish actually left anything behind that I should be worried about. Turns out it does. It leaves some oils down. Those oils could prevent the Partol paste from adhering to the mold and basically could prevent either the epoxy from curing or worse, have the part actually stick to the mold. So did some more Googling. Turns out I should completely wipe down and strip this mold with acetone to get every last bit of this oil off as I can. And then that way, hopefully that Partol paste will do its job. So we'll go ahead, clean this up, and then let the layers of Partol paste begin. Well, the gel coat gods had to get one more sucker punch in before I can make this expletive part. The gel coat right down here was really thin. There was a bubble underneath it, apparently, probably because I didn't get that first layer down close enough, which is why it's so important. It broke through, and now I need to make a repair. I'm not sure if this is how you're supposed to make repairs, but we're going to follow the okayest approach. I'm going to just mix up a little bit more gel coat I'm going to drizzle it into that little bubble, let gravity kind of do its thing, and let her rip. I'm not at all worried about what this is going to look like. It's in a section you will never see, and it's going to have to get faired and bondoed and cleaned up anyways once it's on the helicopter. So that's what we're going to do, and then right back at it. All right, so the gel coat repair job cured overnight. It's plenty hard. There is a little bit of extra positive material there, so we're going to take it down with some 220 and then 400. Once again, the only thing this is doing is going to survive through the layup process. It doesn't need to be pretty. We're not going to see it, so we just need to make it functional. All right, so it's time to start making some templates for the carbon that I'll be cutting. And I think it's really important that I basically walk you through the evolution and my thought process as this has progressed. So my original thought was that I was going to have to put the two mold halves together and basically lay up the entire carbon layup inside an already assembled mold. And the reason for that is because I initially thought with the material that I had and the size of the rolls that I was going to have to split this cowling up into basically 4 sections. So I'd have a triangle along this side, I'd have a triangle that spanned the center gap, the seam line on the bottom, same thing on the top, and then once again on the other side. And so since I would have a continuous piece of carbon over that seam line, then therein lies why I would have to have the molds completely assembled to do that. Turns out I got a little lucky. My roll is 50 inches long. This blue tape on this side represents the back bulkhead of the stock white fuselage. And so that is where the cowling mates essentially to the fuselage. I have to mount this cowling in 2 locations. So it's going to mount along the fuselage with probably quarter turn fasteners or something of the sort. And then it's also going to mount on a permanent flange around the boom. So once again, there will be a permanent piece of carbon attached to the tail boom that has this flange attached to it. There will be a similar style flange on the back side of the fuselage, kind of like a skirt coming rearward. And then that's how the cowling will mount to the helicopter with those 2 locations. I also need in those 2 locations, and this is where things get kind of lucky and interesting, but anywhere that I planned on having fasteners go through the carbon, I'd prefer to have a little bit extra thickness. And so I initially thought, well, I'll just lay up additional layers on top of or behind on the inside to give me that thickness, and that's where I would get it from. Well, this is where things got lucky. If I plan on my template for my triangle to basically run on this line, and then I overlap the piece of carbon that is going to go on the fuselage. You want an overlap region, right? So if I then extend that piece of fabric, we'll call it 2 inches past the first piece, then now I have a 2-inch section that has twice as many plies. So for example, if I did a layup of 6 plies everywhere, I would have 12 plies in just that overlap section. Once again, I was saying I needed extra material. So that automatically gives me that extra bulk if I strategically plan where those overlaps are. So that's what I'm going to do with these templates. I'll have an overlapped section here where I know that I'm going to eventually cut the piece off, and that's where all my mounting bolts will go. And then I'm going to do the exact same thing back here. I'll have a template and give me an overlap section of about 2 inches so that I have extra bulk back here, and that solves that problem. I also just so happened to, when I was laying this out, that means that I can run my roll vertically, and I can basically span half of the mold with 1 piece of carbon. 2 things about that. 1, this thing's going to look sick when it's done because you'll basically have no seam lines. It'll just be 1 pure piece of carbon, which is going to be awesome. But 2, now my seam lines are going to be, or my templates basically, will end at the seam line of the mold. So this makes the layup way easier. I can lay up my carbon into the two mold halves, and then once I have it laid in and secure, I can then bring those mold halves together, bolt them together, and there will be overlap at the seam, but then I can basically just lay those alternating layers in at the seam, and it'll be a nice and pretty layup. This will all make sense more as I get into layup, but I just wanted to go over kind of the thought process of kind of how I got to here, and basically how I went from somewhat of a nightmare of a layup to what I think will actually be better, way easier, and I won't have any seams, and it's going to look sweet. So sorry to ramble on, but I'm stoked with stumbling across the solution, and I think it's going to be sick. So you're going to have to excuse the poor lighting, but this was probably one of the most difficult things I've had to figure out for this layup. So I need a way to mark the parting line between the cowling and the fuselage. And that parting line should be defined by a bulkhead that is behind here. Now, I don't actually know where that bulkhead is on the outside, obviously, because there's no marks. And I couldn't make a mark on the plug, because if I did, then I couldn't get this nice smooth transition with a nice block sander. So basically, I was left with leaving a smooth surface, kicking the bucket further down to the road, and figuring it out later. Well, we are where the bucket is now. So my solution basically was to measure from the inside of the fuselage back to the bulkhead, and then transfer that measurement best I could to the outside of the plug. That's what you see on these marks. I then have an offset for how far I think that skirt should be, and basically right here where the laser line is, this is where I think I want that parting line to be. So I measured out back here to make sure that my laser was perpendicular to the helicopter, and that's what's casting this light over here. So that should be perfectly straight up and down, and yes, the bulkhead on this helicopter actually is totally vertical as well, so these lines should be okay enough in parallel. So that's what we're going for. Now, the next challenge is going to be, how do I transfer this location of this laser line on my plug to my mold? Well, I've taken measurements from the clay, or hard marks on the plug, which is transferred directly to the mold, and I've basically transferred a couple lines using a measuring tape to the mold. And then I'm going to use the same laser line setup to cast a line onto the mold, and that is exactly where my parting line should be on the mold. Is it going to work? I don't know. But that's what I got, so that's what we're going with. And now over here at the mold, I've got my laser up there. I've got my marks on the mold on either side, and it's casting a line where that template, or now that cut piece of carbon, should line up at least relatively close to that line. And the last thing we need to talk about is how I actually plan to make the flange, where the connection between the red part, which will be the cowling, and the black part, which will be attached to the helicopter, and how I'm going to make that connection. So I basically need some form of joggle to make a flange, or a lap joint, so that when from the outside, when the parts are together, you have this nice smooth transition between the fuselage and the cowling, but you still have something that you can put a bolt through. Now, the original way I was going to do this, full credit to Mike Patey, he, on his cowling for Scrappy, I believe, he came up with a pretty unique and clever solution to do this, where you basically start with
your carbon part. So you lay up the entire part, not worrying about any flanges or anything. Then you come back and you lay in a piece of packing tape. So the orange here represents the packing tape. That packing tape will inhibit the bond between the next layer of carbon that you put onto your part. So you put that piece of packing tape on, and then you lay in an additional layup on the inside of your part that spans from your carbon part over the packing tape, and you let that cure. Then, once that's done, you come and you trim your carbon part, and you put just basically a parting line in your carbon part, and then you pull the two pieces away, and what you end up with is something similar to this, where you have your original carbon part, you have the new layup that creates your joggle. It separates from your second carbon part because of that packing tape. And now you have two separate parts that you can join together with your flange. But when you put it together, you have this nice, perfect, seamless, flush surface because, once again, your original part made it. And so it's a perfectly seamless transition. Now, there's not to discredit Mike Patey at all. The guy's brilliant. But he did this, and I planned on using this solution. He used it for things like an oil door, things that are basically non-structural and just needed to function. The flaw in this design is the fact that you end up with a lap joint, and the only thing holding your flange to the rest of the part is basically a epoxy bond between the new blue flange and the black original carbon part. There's nothing mechanically connecting them other than the epoxy that sits between them. And so your joint is only as strong as your epoxy. Now that becomes even more of an issue for what I'm doing, because now when I come back and I go to bond this side to my fuselage, right? So this is the white fuselage. Now I'm going to have a bond between the fuselage and a piece of carbon, and then a separate bond between my new flange to my fuselage, or to my cowling. So now I have two bonded joints that aren't at all mechanically fixed before I get to my cowling, which needs to hold structural loads. And so I'm putting a whole lot out there on just two epoxy bonded joints. Not ideal. All right, so once I realized that the last solution was not ideal, I spent the next few days trying to come up with something else and basically came up with this solution. The big difference between the two is the previous one I could do a secondary layup down the road and make my lap joint, but this one has to be done all in the same layup and infused at the same time. So let's step through this. The right side of this drawing is the cowling, the left side of this drawing is the fuselage, and then that orange is actually the main fuselage of the helicopter. So the outermost layer is the beauty layer. That is going to be done with 3K 2x2, standard, same way I would do everything else. And then now everything gets different. The stack up that I'm going for on the majority of this is a 3K layer followed by two 6K layers. And that will be the full stack up. So it'll be roughly like 5 layers of 3K basically when it's done. So that I need to have on the cowling, and I need to also have that on my flange. So we'll get there in a second. So the 3K outer surface, totally normal. Then we follow that up with a 6K layer where the lap joint will be. To bulk the cowling side for the added strength for the flange, I'm then adding 2 more additional 6K layers just for bulk. And then I'm adding the 4th layer of 6K over the top of that. Now, the reason I did this is because all your strength comes from the fibers, and you're better off having the continuous fibers being the outer and innermost plies. And so that's why I did the bulk in the middle of these 2 plies, and I didn't just put it on top. So now we have the outermost pretty layer, 2 layers of 6K with some bulk in the middle, and then I'm putting down some Kevlar, and we'll explain why in a second. That Kevlar then gets covered similar to the previous solution, but instead of packing tape, I'm going to be using peel ply. The peel ply will inhibit the bond between the following layers. And so you'll notice here too that all of the red plies go out towards the cowling, and then we're getting to the blue plies, which are headed towards the fuselage. So on top of the peel ply, I have my first layer of 6K that goes towards the fuselage. I am doing a bulk layer, so a single bulk layer of 6K that only spans the gap and slightly further. And then I follow again with that final layer of 6K towards the fuselage again. So my final stack up is 3K, 6K, 6K. Over here, it's 3K, 6K, 6K, and then this is my joint. Now this is where things get interesting. The hardest part about this whole thing is that once the layup's done, I need to be able to cut from the outside through this joint and separate it. So as I cut through the joint, once it gets to the peel ply, then I'll basically have a way to separate the cowling from the flange. Now, how do you do that? Well, I've now strategically placed all of my lap joints in the outermost beauty layer, exactly where I want my joint to start. So I inherently built in a cutting guide in my outer 3K carbon layer, so that as long as I cut on that line, then it's going to cut into the joint that I'm trying to create. Now, this is where things get also more interesting. My Kevlar layer, the green layer, that is only there as a depth finder. So I'm going to be cutting into this blind, and I basically wanted a way to know when I got to my peel ply layer without going past it and then cutting into my flange, which would totally just ruin the structural integrity of the flange. So as I'm cutting out here, once I get to that peel ply, it'll be very apparent that I've made it far enough and I need to stop cutting. Excuse me, when I get to the Kevlar layer, it will tell me that. The peel ply will pop the two loose, and then I'll eventually have my outer cowling part with my added thickness, which I need for strength, and then the inner cowling, or the inner part, inner flange, will go directly to the fuselage. This is better because now I have continuous fibers from the edge of my flange all the way in to where the fuselage will be. That'll be bonded, or I may even use fasteners as well, but that way I have a full mechanical connection in the strongest part of carbon fiber, which are the fibers, going all the way from the flange to the fuselage, and then once again from my, I guess, bulked up area on my cowling all the way through the rest of the cowling. It's going to make the layup a lot more difficult, but if I can pull this off, it'll be a phenomenal way to make this flange, and then once it all goes back together, then you basically will have a perfect seam between your cowling and your fuselage, because the original layer, that 3K layer, was continuous from the start. All right, I just got my last coat of Pardal paste down and buffed off. Basically, it took about a half hour to do all 3 pieces of the mold. I put it down, I waited about, I don't know, about 10 minutes for it all to flash off and get hazy, and then polished it down after that, followed by at least an hour between coats. That way I didn't basically just smear the second coat into the first coat and have it not actually build up. You want to leave enough time for it to cure and get hard, and then make that protective coating. So while these molds are as clean as they ever will be, it's always a good time right now to throw down your tacky tape. Now, this is a little bit different. This is a multi-piece mold, and as I mentioned before, I want to use resin infusion. Resin infusion requires a perfect seal in the bag, and you can't get that if you were to just bolt this mold together. You would actually be leaking through that parting line, and that is no good. So there's 2 ways you can bat this. I'm being a little ambitious. I want to see if I can actually make a seal between the 2 molds. instead of actually bagging or envelope bagging the entire mold. Now, I'm probably going to end up doing that, so we'll find out here in a little bit. But to seal the two molds, I'm going to be using 16th inch by 3/8 butyl glazing tape. It's basically the same thing as your tacky tape, just not quite as thick, so it will hopefully allow those seams to close as tight as possible, and I won't end up with a mark in my part. Now that does need to go on the inside of your bolt circle. If you put it on the outside of the bolt circle, then obviously air will leak through the bolts and it defeats the entire purpose. So the question is, Callie, why the heck are you doing this? Is it worth it? Well, two things. Again, if you don't put anything in between your parting, or in between the molds on your parting line, and you do pull perfect vacuum and it is fully envelope bagged, the odds of you sucking resin into your parting line and going all the way through and then actually leaving the outside of the mold is pretty great. Wherever there's a void, there will be resin that fills. So that seal that I'm going to be putting in, if it does fail to create a perfect vacuum, it should, keyword should there, should help prevent the resin from escaping the mold. There should be a dam or a barrier that will end up creating, and will hopefully help me out in the long run. So either way, it's going to be a good idea. The thought experiment of trying to make a seal, well, that's a little ambitious. We'll see if it actually works. And for the rest of the mold, where there is no parting line, we'll just use the traditional yellow tacky tape to make that seal. I transferred the template I made from the plug to this really thick blue felt stuff that I had lying around. This stuff is actually really nice, especially for working with things like the stabilized 3K, because that 3K doesn't actually conform to geometry as well as unstabilized fabric. And so it was pretty important to get a good idea of how that stiffer fabric would lay down and make sure that it was cut and prepared accordingly. Once these rough cuts were put in, I did come back later and trim them to a final size, and overall it worked out pretty good. I laid down a thick layer of plastic drop cloth just to keep everything clean, and all that was left was to throw the templates on top of the first layer and start cutting. That's going to do it for this one. All that prep work took a whole lot more time and effort than I anticipated. Make sure you're subscribed and come back next week as we throw down the rest of this carbon fiber, get these molds put together, and start that resin infusion. You definitely don't want to miss that. As always, go build something cool, never stop learning, and we'll see you on the next one.